It was, as one newspaper noted, a diabolical act, unparalleled in the annals of terrorism. On September 16, 1920, as the bells of Trinity Church tolled and hundreds of Wall Street workers headed out for their noontime break, an explosion struck outside the headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company, the world's most powerful banking institution.
The bomb broke windows, it knocked trolley cars off their tracks 2 blocks away, it ignited curtains 12 stories in the air. It was just a savage, horrifying thing.
People fled their places of work, and they saw basically a war zone.
This was an attack on civilians, just for the sole purpose of creating terror.
The blast left 38 dead and hundreds more injured. Striking at the heart of the nation's financial center, many wondered if this was the spectacular blow against capitalism that radical agitators had so long discussed.
The corner of Wall and Broad Streets represented the fusion of American capitalism with American government. You could target them both at once.
The targeted is to say we are taking on the citadel of American capitalism. We loathe it, we want to overthrow it.
Financial centers around the country went on high alert. The head of the Morgan Bank sent guards to his family's Madison Avenue residence. As federal troops arrived to protect the nearby U.S. Sub-Treasury building, investigators sifted through the rubble for clues.
It's not at all clear who might be responsible. So many people out there had a grudge against Wall Street that people wondered, well, it could be any one of these forces, which of course increases the anxiety even more.
Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer arrived on the scene and told reporters the explosion on Wall Street was the terrorist attack he had warned Americans about. For more than a year, in the tumultuous aftermath of World War I, he had been at the center of a bitter national debate about how far the government should go to protect the nation from acts of political violence. Palmer pointed to the carnage on Wall Street as proof of the need to renew aggressive action.
It's easy to think about terrorism as this frightening plague of the early 21st century. The Wall Street bombing suggests it actually has a much longer and deeper history. How widespread government surveillance ought to be, what kinds of policies are justified in containing a threat, those questions were being openly asked in 1920.
In January 1919, ships carrying thousands of soldiers home from World War I sailed into New York Harbor. Filled with hopes for a better future, the troops were greeted by cheering crowds, eager to leave behind the horrors of a brutal war that had left 16 million dead. Returning soldiers had reason to feel optimistic about the economic opportunities ahead. Corporate profits had tripled and stock prices had boomed during the war, helping to create 42,000 new millionaires.
World War I really was a watershed moment in terms of the American economy. The United States, for the first time, is a creditor nation, so Europe owes the United States more money than the United States owes to Europe. This is a big coming-of-age moment.
Profitable though it proved to be, the war also created economic and political divisions that threatened to derail dreams of post-war peace and prosperity.
while the American economy in general benefited from the war, the chief beneficiary was the financial establishment centered in New York.
There was some pent-up frustration about the fortunes that had been accumulated during the war. There was the sense that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. There was also the bitter legacy of the repression that occurred under the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act.
Shortly after American entry into World War I, President Wilson had signed espionage and sedition laws, which made it a federal crime to speak out against the government or the war. The legislation was an unprecedented regulation of free speech that sent thousands to jail and fostered an atmosphere of suspicion.
Americans were schooled throughout the entire war in being afraid of things, in being afraid of foreigners, in being afraid of German spies, in being afraid of anyone who wasn't sort of like the majority, which was essentially white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant.
The president spoke against hyphenated Americans. You shouldn't call yourself German Americans or any other type of hyphenated Americans. The war really ratcheted up that sense of American patriotism, jingoism, if you want to call it that.
By early 1919, Americans conditioned to fear Germans were focusing their anxieties on a new global threat: Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik revolutionaries, who had seized power in Russia to form a communist state.
The Bolshevik Revolution was the world's first successful anti-capitalist revolution in which it appeared that the working class had risen up and overthrown its masters and put something very, very different in its place.
It was much bigger than something that happened in Russia. It was followed by a series of left-wing uprisings right after World War I in Germany, in Hungary, in Italy, in Argentina, in other countries around the world. For that moment in 1919, the world was really in play. These countries were in play.
Lenin comes out and says, we want the workers to take over the world. And you begin to see glimmers of this happening in the United States.
On February 5, 1919, Seattle Mayor Ole Hansen sent an urgent message to the U.S. Secretary of War. The entire city of Seattle was about to be shut down in the first general labor strike in U.S. history. The strike began 2 weeks earlier. 35,000 shipyard workers had walked off the job demanding higher wages to cope with rising living costs.
From the point of view of workers, this was their time. They had sacrificed so much for the war, including their wages, and they had seen their employers gain when they fell behind.
In an unprecedented show of solidarity, 25,000 workers from other unions joined the walkout.
The entire city was shut down for a few days. The trolleys did not run, other industries did not show up to work, etc. And of course, this really alarmed the powers that be.
It raised a specter of what organized labor could accomplish, and it was scary to a lot of people.